Ever wondered what car features were once essential but are now totally obsolete? In the 1950s, your car could have been started with a hand crank, and you probably needed a manual choke to get it running. From bench seats that could fit 3 people in the front to foot-pedal high beam switches, these quirky, outdated features might surprise you. Let's take a fun ride down memory lane and explore 25 car things that were once necessary but are now completely gone. Number 25. Hand crank starters. Hand crank starters were necessary to start car engines before electric starters were invented. Drivers had to manually turn a metal crank inserted into the front of the car to start the engine. This method was common in the early 1900s, but required a lot of physical effort and was risky, as the crank could kick back and cause injuries. In 1912, Charles Kettering invented the electric starter, which was first used in the Cadillac Model 302. This new invention made starting cars much safer and easier, removing the need for manual cranking. By the 1960s, most cars came with electric starters as standard, bringing an end to the era of hand cranks. This innovation changed the way people started their cars and improved overall convenience. Number 24. Manual chokes. Manual chokes were necessary for starting car engines, particularly in cold weather. Located in the carburetor, the choke was a small valve that controlled the air-fuel mixture entering the engine. To start a cold engine, drivers would pull a lever or knob to close the choke, reducing the air intake and adding more fuel. This helped the engine start and run smoothly until it warmed up. In the 1950s, most cars had manual chokes, and drivers had to remember to gradually open the choke as the engine heated up to prevent stalling or flooding. This required attention and skill, making driving more involved compared to modern cars. With the introduction of electronic fuel injection systems in the 1980s, manual chokes became unnecessary and were then phased out. Number 23. Bench seats. Front bench seats were a common feature in cars, especially in the 1950s. These seats stretched across the entire width of the car, allowing 3 people to sit comfortably in the front.
We talk a lot about a bench seat and it's kind of snuggling up to your date or to your special
I miss those
someone.
days.
I know, it was kind of fun.
They were popular because they offered more seating space and created a cozy social atmosphere. Families in larger vehicles like station wagons favored these seats, but bench seats had some problems. They didn't provide as much support or safety compared to the bucket seats used in modern cars.
So we have to be cognizant of that. You have to have seat belts. A lot of these cars, if you notice, there are no seat belts in this car.
Sure.
It wasn't required.
As car designs improved, manufacturers started focusing on individual seats to provide better comfort and safety. By the 1980s, bench seats began disappearing and were replaced by bucket seats, which offered better support and ergonomics for both drivers and passengers. Number 22. Vent windows. Vent windows were a common feature in cars, especially in the 1950s. These small triangular windows were positioned in the front of the main side windows and could be opened to allow air to flow into the car. Before air conditioning became widespread, vent windows provided a welcome breeze, helping to cool the car on hot days. They were also useful for clearing fog from the windshield and bringing in fresh air without the noise and turbulence that came with fully opening the windows. As air conditioning systems became more affordable and effective in the 1960s and 70s, the need for vent windows decreased. By the 1990s, most car manufacturers had removed them, opting for sleeker, more aerodynamic designs instead. Number 21. Foot pedal high beam switches. Foot pedal high beam switches were a common feature in cars from the 1930s to the 1970s. These switches were placed on the floor near the driver's left foot and allowed drivers to change between low and high beam headlights with just a tap of their foot. The setup was practical because it let drivers keep their hands on the steering wheel and their eyes on the road while adjusting the headlights. The foot pedal switch was particularly helpful for driving on rural roads or poorly lit highways where frequent adjustments to the headlights were needed. As car designs evolved, manufacturers moved the high beam switch to the steering column for better convenience and safety. By the late 1970s and early 80s, most cars had adopted this new design. Number 20. Carburetors. Carburetors were important parts of cars, responsible for mixing air and fuel for the engine. They were invented in the late 1800s and became widely used in the early 1900s. Carburetors work by using the Venturi effect to pull fuel into the air, creating the right mixture for the engine to burn. This was essential for the engine's performance and fuel efficiency. By the 1950s, carburetors were found in almost all cars. They were simple to use but needed regular maintenance and adjustments to perform well. Drivers had to manually adjust the carburetor for changes in altitude and temperature. Despite their usefulness, carburetors had limitations, especially when it came to maintaining the perfect air-fuel mixture under different driving conditions. Number 19. Generator charging systems. Generator charging systems were crucial for powering a car's electrical components in the past. These systems, also known as dynamos, converted mechanical energy from the engine into electrical energy. From the early 1900s until the 1960s, generators were widely used in vehicles to supply power for lights, radios, and other electrical accessories. However, they had some drawbacks, such as poor voltage regulation and a tendency to overcharge batteries. The introduction of alternators in the 1960s brought significant improvements. Unlike generators, alternators used a rotating magnetic field to generate electricity, making them more efficient and reliable. Alternators could produce more power at lower engine speeds and provided better voltage regulation, which reduced the risk of overcharging. Number 18. Bias ply tires. Bias ply tires were the standard for cars, widely used from the early 20th century until the 1970s. These tires were made with layers of rubber-coated fabric called plies that were placed diagonally across the tire. This design made them strong and durable, but they also had some downsides, like a rougher ride and less traction. In the 1950s, bias ply tires were commonly used on most vehicles, but their limitations became clearer as cars became faster and more powerful. Radial tires, introduced by Michelin in 1946, brought significant improvements. With plies arranged at 90 degrees to the direction of travel, radial tires offered better flexibility, traction, fuel efficiency, and a longer lifespan. They also provided a smoother ride. Number 17. Ashtrays and cigarette lighters. Ashtrays and cigarette lighters were common in cars, especially in the 1950s. Smoking was very popular at that time, and car manufacturers added built-in ashtrays and lighters to meet the needs of smokers. Ashtrays were usually placed on the dashboard or at the back of the front seats, providing a convenient place to dispose of cigarette ashes and butts. Cigarette lighters were usually integrated into the dashboard, making it easier for drivers and passengers to light their cigarettes. These features were considered standard in most cars, reflecting the social habits of the period. As awareness of the health risks of smoking grew, smoking rates declined, and car manufacturers started removing ashtrays and lighters in the 1980s and 1990s. Number 16. Manual steering. Manual steering used to be the standard in cars, requiring drivers to use physical strength to turn the steering wheel and control the vehicle. This system, also called non-power steering, relied solely on mechanical parts connecting the steering wheel to the wheels. While it allowed drivers to feel the road, it made steering difficult, especially at low speeds or when parking. In the 1950s, manual steering was common in most cars, and drivers had to put a lot of effort to steer, which could be tiring and challenging. The introduction of power steering in the mid-1900s changed driving by reducing the effort needed to steer, making it more comfortable and easier. Number 15. Drum brakes. Drum brakes were the standard braking system in cars from the early 1900s until the 1960s. Invented by Louis Renault in 1902, they worked by pressing brake shoes against the inner surface of a rotating drum attached to the wheel. This friction slowed the wheel, stopping the car.
Grip at 50 miles an hour, one like this has to move 12 pints of water per second.
In the 1950s, Most vehicles used drum brakes because they were simple and effective. However, they had some problems, like overheating and brake fade during heavy use, making them less reliable for high-performance or heavy-duty vehicles.
Men from the Hendon Police College, here's the newest brainwave in brakes, the disc brake. It's a large metal disc, vertical and running with a wheel. Needs no adjustment, resists heat and water.
Drum brakes also needed regular maintenance and adjustments. The introduction of disc brakes in the 1960s led to the decline of drum brakes in passenger cars. Number 14. AM radios. AM radios were a common feature in cars, offering entertainment and news long before FM radio and digital media became popular. AM, or amplitude modulation, was the first method used for audio broadcasting and became widely used in the early 1900s. In the 1950s, AM radios were the main source of in-car entertainment, providing music, news, and talk shows. Families enjoyed listening to their favorite programs while traveling, making road trips more enjoyable. But AM radios had some problems, like static and interference from electrical devices. The sound quality was lower than FM radio, which became popular in the 1970s due to clearer and better sound. Over time, FM radios, cassette players, and now digital media players replaced AM radios in cars. Number 13. Manual transmission. Manual transmissions, also called stick shifts, were the standard in cars for many years. They required drivers to change gears themselves using a gear stick and clutch pedal. This system gave drivers control over the vehicle's speed and power by choosing the right gear. In the 1950s, most cars had either 3-speed or 4-speed manual transmissions. Driving a manual transmission needed skill and coordination, as drivers had to match the engine speed with the selected gear. This process, known as rev matching, was important for smooth gear changes. Despite being challenging to learn, many drivers appreciated the control and engagement that manual transmissions offered. Number 12. No seat belts. In the 1950s, many cars did not have seat belts as standard equipment. Back then, people didn't realize how important seat belts were for safety. Some cars had lap belts, but they were not widely used. Many believed it was safer to be thrown from a car during an accident instead of being strapped inside. A major change happened in 1959 when Volvo introduced the 3-point seatbelt designed by Niels Bohlin. This belt, which protected both the upper and lower body, significantly improved safety. It took a while for this innovation to spread, and in the U.S., seatbelts became mandatory in all new cars in the late 1960s. Number 11. Steel dashboards. Steel dashboards were a common feature in cars during the 1950s. These dashboards were made entirely of metal, with knobs and controls that stuck out. While they were tough, they posed serious safety risks during accidents. Passengers could suffer injuries from hitting the hard surface. In the 1930s, Dr. Claire L. Straith, a plastic surgeon from Detroit, began pushing for safer car interiors after treating many accident victims. He designed a padded dashboard to reduce injuries, but car makers didn't take notice until the 1940s and 50s. Chrysler was among the first to add padded dashboards in 1949, and by the 1960s, most cars included some type of padding. Number 10. Vacuum windshield wipers. Vacuum windshield wipers were a common feature in cars, especially in the 1950s. These wipers used the engine's vacuum to create suction that moved the blades back and forth. While they were a new idea at the time, they had a major issue. The wipers slowed down or stopped when the car accelerated. This happened because the engine's vacuum decreased as the car sped up, reducing the power needed to move the wipers. Drivers had to be careful, especially in heavy rain, as the wipers could become unreliable. Vacuum wipers were used until the late 1950s and early 1960s when electric wipers replaced them, offering more consistent performance powered by an electric motor. Number 9. Push-button transmissions. Push-button transmissions were a new feature in cars during the 1950s and early 1960s. Chrysler introduced them in 1956, allowing drivers to change gears by pressing buttons on the dashboard instead of using a traditional gear stick.
It's a new idea that puts shifting where it belongs, so you can keep both hands safely at the wheel.
This system aimed to be more convenient and give the car's interior a modern feel by creating more space. It was used in various Chrysler cars like Plymouth, Dodge, and DeSoto.
And look, you can shift and turn the wheel at the same time, where the control remains stationary.
The system was praised for being simple and easy to use, making gear changes quick. But it also had some downsides. It was more complicated and expensive to fix, and some drivers found it harder to use than just a regular gear shift. Number 8. Hand signals for turning. Before electric turn signals became common, hand signals were very important for driving. Drivers used them to show their plans to other people on the road. For a left turn, drivers stretched their arm straight out. To signal a right turn, they bent their left arm upward at the elbow. To show that they were stopping or slowing down, they pointed their left arm down. These hand signals were necessary for safety because they helped other drivers understand the driver's intentions, reducing accidents. In the 1950s, many cars didn't have built-in turn signals, so hand signals were essential. By the 1960s, as electric signals became standard, hand signals became less common. Number 7. Running boards. Running boards were a popular feature on cars, especially in the 1950s. These narrow steps were attached to the sides of vehicles to help passengers get in and out more easily. Early 20th century cars were built higher off the ground, so running boards provided a helpful place to step on. They were also handy for carrying luggage or other items that couldn't fit inside the car. Running boards weren't just practical, they also added style to the car. Many were decorated with chrome or polished aluminum, which improved the vehicle's appearance. As car designs changed and became lower, running boards were no longer needed, and by the 1960s, most cars stopped using them. Number 6. Mechanical fuel pumps. Mechanical fuel pumps were important for moving fuel from the tank to the engine in cars. Introduced in the 1920s, these pumps were powered by the engine's camshaft or crankshaft. They used a lever and a diaphragm to create suction, pulling fuel into the pump and pushing it to the carburetor. These pumps worked at low pressure, usually between 4 to 6 pounds per square inch, which was enough for carbureted engines. By the 1950s, they were standard in most vehicles, but they had issues like vapor lock, where fuel would vaporize before reaching the pump, causing engine stalls. Their placement in the engine compartment also made them vulnerable to heat problems. The introduction of electric fuel pumps in the 1970s improved fuel delivery, offering more reliable pressure and less sensitivity to heat. Number 5. Horn ring. Horn rings were a popular feature in cars during the 1950s and 60s. They were attached to the steering wheel, and drivers could honk the horn by pressing the ring. This made it easier to warn other drivers or pedestrians. The design was practical and stylish, with many cars featuring chrome or decorative elements on the interior. The horn ring was a big improvement over earlier horn buttons, which were sometimes in awkward places. By placing the horn on the steering wheel, drivers could use it quickly without removing their hands from the wheel, making driving safer and more convenient. Number 4. Tail fins. Tail fins became a distinctive feature on cars, especially in the 1950s and early 1960s. They were first introduced by Cadillac in 1948 and were inspired by the smooth lines of jet planes and rockets. Initially small, the tail fins grew larger and more dramatic over time, reaching their peak size in 1959 with a Cadillac Eldorado. The fins were not just for looks, they represented the excitement and forward-thinking spirit of the post-war period.
Atomic-powered rocket boosters. In fact, it didn't have a motor of any kind. These were only a styling touch.
Car manufacturers believed these fins made their cars appear more modern and cutting-edge, tapping into the public's fascination with space exploration and technology. This design trend quickly spread. with many American car brands adding tail fins to their models. Number 3. Glove Box Minibar. The Glove Box Minibar was a special and luxurious feature in some high-end cars from the 1950s. A well-known example was the 1957 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham, which had a minibar built inside the glove box. This minibar included magnetized decanters and glassware to keep them from moving around while the car was driving. The purpose of the glove box minibar was to add elegance and convenience, letting passengers enjoy a drink on the go. This feature showed the luxury and creativity of that time, appealing to wealthy car buyers who loved style and comfort. As drinking and driving laws became stricter, people began to question whether it was safe or practical to have a minibar in the car. Number 2. Ttops. Ttops, also known as T-bar roofs, were a popular feature in cars during the 1970s and 80s. They combined open-air driving with the strength of a solid roof. The idea was patented by industrial designer Gordon Burig in 1951.
There's a new out-of-sight T-bar roof available on Aspen coupes. Remove the tinted glass panels, and Aspen has the open-air feeling of a convertible.
Ttops had 2 removable roof panels on either side of a central bar that ran down the middle of the car. This design let drivers enjoy the experience of a convertible while keeping the safety and stability of a hardtop. The first car to include Ttops was the 1968 Chevrolet Corvette, and soon other car brands like Pontiac with its Trans Am began offering them.
People usually tend to steal the Ttops. These are very expensive parts of the car that are very easily removable.
The removable panels were usually made of glass or acrylic, adding to the unique driving experience. And at number 1, Fender mounted mirrors. Fender mounted mirrors were common on cars in the 1950s and 60s. These mirrors were attached to the front fenders instead of the doors, giving the cars a unique appearance and some practical advantages. In Japan, these mirrors became required on passenger vehicles in the 1960s to improve visibility and safety. The design allowed drivers to view the mirrors through the windshield, helping to reduce blind spots and making it easier to drive through narrow streets. Classic cars like the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL and the Toyota 2000 GT have these mirrors, adding a stylish touch that made them stand out. Despite their appeal, Fender-mounted mirrors had some downsides, including being difficult to adjust and not very helpful when reversing. From dashboard ashtrays to manual window cranks, the 1950s were packed with car features we'd never thought we'd leave behind. Which outdated car feature do you miss the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more nostalgic trips down memory lane.